With nowhere left to go, 21-year-old Alice Walker spent one cold October night sleeping inside an abandoned barn, believing she had reached the end of her story. By sunrise, she uncovered a secret hidden for 50 years. Beneath the old wooden floor, she found a forgotten journal, a tiny music box, and a faded photograph that should never have existed. According to every official record, her mother had died years before that photograph was taken. So, who was the woman smiling back at her? Alice had no way of knowing that within weeks, the abandoned barn would be demolished forever, and with it, the last chance to uncover a truth buried for half a century. Stay with me, because what she discovered didn't just rewrite her past. It restored the names, the lives, and the hope of people the world had almost forgotten. Some stories begin with a single decision. Others begin with a secret. This one began with both, long before Alice Walker ever saw the old barn standing alone in a Kentucky field. Something had been waiting for her beneath its wooden floor, a secret buried for nearly 50 years. A secret somehow connected to the silver necklace she had worn since childhood. But Alice knew none of that. At 21 years old, she believed she had reached the end of her road. 15 years earlier, she had sat beside her mother's hospital bed, too young to understand that goodbye could last forever. Before closing her eyes for the final time, her mother slipped a worn silver necklace around Alice's neck. Hanging from it was a tiny 6-petal flower. Then she whispered words Alice would never forget. If there ever comes a day when you believe you're completely alone, keep walking for just one more day. Sometimes tomorrow is already looking for you. Those were the last words her mother ever spoke. After that, Alice grew up in foster care, moving from one home to another. No family was cruel to her, but none ever became home. After enough goodbyes, she stopped unpacking all her belongings. She stopped expecting anyone to remember her birthday. She learned that the safest way to avoid heartbreak was never to feel too settled. When she turned 18, she aged out of the system with nothing but a backpack, an old photograph of her mother, and the silver necklace she had never taken off. She worked hard. She found a small apartment. For a little while, life finally seemed to be moving forward. Then the diner where she worked closed without warning. Within weeks, her savings disappeared. Soon after, so did her home. For days, Alice slept wherever she could inside her old car until it broke down, beneath the awning of closed buildings, or on church benches when no one asked her to leave. The cold was difficult. The hunger was worse, but neither hurt as much as the silence. What frightened her most was the thought that if she disappeared tomorrow, no one would even know she was gone. Late one rainy October afternoon, exhausted and soaked to the bone, Alice finally stopped walking. She wrapped her fingers around the necklace beneath her jacket and quietly repeated her mother's words. Just one more day. When she opened her eyes, she noticed an old wooden barn standing alone beyond the empty fields. Its roof sagged with age. Several windows were broken. It looked as though the world had forgotten it years ago. To anyone else, it was simply an abandoned barn. To Alice, it looked like one more chance to survive the night. She picked up her backpack and started toward it. She had no idea that before sunrise, she would uncover the first clue to a mystery that would change everything she believed about her past, and lead her to a man named Benjamin Sullivan, the last living guardian of a secret no one had dared to tell for half a century. The rain had almost stopped by the time Alice reached the barn. Up close, it looked even older than she had imagined. The faded red paint had long since peeled away, leaving weathered gray boards scarred by decades of wind, rain, and harsh Kentucky winters. Several windows were broken, and the heavy wooden doors hung slightly crooked on rusted hinges. It was the kind of place most people would drive past without a second glance. To Alice, it looked like mercy. She pushed against one of the doors. It groaned loudly before giving way, releasing the familiar scent of old hay, damp wood, and dust that had settled undisturbed for years. Inside, the barn was quiet, not ordinary quiet, the kind of silence that made every small sound seem important. Rainwater dripped steadily through a crack in the roof. Somewhere in the darkness, a pigeon fluttered its wings before settling again. Alice stood still for a moment, listening. No voices, no footsteps, no sign that anyone had been there recently. She finally let out the breath she had been holding. For the first time in several days, she wasn't worrying about being asked to leave. She found a relatively dry corner near a stack of old hay bales and carefully removed her soaked jacket. Her stomach growled. Dinner was a granola bar she had been saving since the day before. She ate it slowly, taking tiny bites, trying to convince herself it would last longer. When it was gone, she smiled sadly. Her mother used to tell her that even the smallest meal deserved gratitude. Some lessons never left you. As darkness settled over the countryside, the temperature dropped quickly. Alice gathered loose pieces of burlap she found in one corner of the barn and wrapped them around herself like a blanket. She leaned against one of the wooden support posts, clutching the silver necklace beneath her sweater. Outside, the wind whistled across the empty fields. Inside, exhaustion finally overcame fear. She fell asleep. A loud crack echoed through the barn sometime before sunrise. Alice's eyes flew open. For one terrifying second, she thought someone had broken in. Instead, she realized one of the old roof beams had shifted beneath the weight of the rain. As she stood, brushing straw from her clothes, she noticed something unusual. A narrow stream of sunlight slipped through a hole in the roof and landed on one particular section of the wooden floor. Most of the boards looked faded with age, but those few boards were different. Cleaner, less worn, as if they had been replaced years after the rest of the floor. Curiosity outweighed caution. Alice knelt beside them and ran her fingers along the edges. One board moved ever so slightly. She frowned carefully. She searched nearby until she found the broken handle of an old shovel. Using it as a lever, she pried upward. The board lifted. Beneath it was a small wooden compartment, barely large enough to hold a shoebox. Alice's heartbeat quickened. For one impossible moment, she wondered if she'd stumbled upon forgotten money, or jewelry, or something valuable enough to change her life. Instead, she found memories. Inside the compartment rested a faded leather journal tied with a worn ribbon. Beside it sat a small wooden music box covered in dust. There was also a pair of tiny children's shoes, carefully polished despite their age. And beneath everything else, a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with time. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were 4 simple words. For whoever finds this. Alice stared at the envelope for several seconds before carefully opening it. The letter inside was short. Very short. If you're reading this, then this place has survived longer than I ever expected. Please don't let our names disappear. Someone must remember, there was no signature, no date, nothing to explain who had written it. Only those 3 haunting sentences. Alice slowly lowered the letter. A strange feeling settled over her. She couldn't explain why, but this no longer felt like an abandoned barn. It felt like someone had been trying to speak across time. She reached for the music box. Its lid resisted at first before opening with a soft click. Inside, the tiny mechanism still worked. When she turned the small metal key, a fragile melody filled the barn. It was slow, gentle, beautiful. The sound echoed through the empty building, as though it had been waiting decades to be heard again. Alice closed her eyes. For just a moment, she remembered sitting in her mother's lap as a little girl, while someone hummed a lullaby she could no longer fully remember. The memory disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Then she noticed something else. Inside the lid of the music box was a carved symbol, a 6-petal flower, exactly like the one engraved on the silver necklace around her neck. Alice froze. Her hands began to tremble. Slowly, she removed the necklace and placed it beside the carving. The two flowers matched perfectly. Every curve, every petal, every tiny detail. It couldn't be a coincidence. Her mother had never spoken about this barn. She had never mentioned Kentucky. She had never explained where the necklace had come from. So, how could the same symbol be hidden inside a music box that had been locked beneath the floor of an abandoned barn for decades? Questions raced through Alice's mind faster than she could answer them. Who had hidden these things? Why did they leave them here? And most frightening of all, how was her mother connected to this place? Alice looked back into the compartment one more time. Tucked beneath the journal, almost hidden beneath years of dust, was the corner of an old photograph. She carefully pulled it free. The image showed a group of children standing in front of the very same barn. Several adults stood behind them. The photograph had faded badly with age. Most of the faces were difficult to recognize, but one young woman near the center was still perfectly clear. Alice's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. She had looked at it every single day since childhood. It was her mother, and in her arms, she was holding a little girl no older than 2. Alice's heart pounded so hard she could hear it. There was only one impossible problem. According to everything Alice had ever believed, the date written on the back of the photograph was nearly 10 years after her mother's recorded death. She whispered only 4 words into the silent barn. That's not possible. Alice couldn't take her eyes off the photograph. The young woman standing in the center wasn't someone who merely resembled her mother. It was her. The same gentle smile. The same kind eyes. Even the silver necklace resting against her sweater was unmistakable. Alice turned the photograph over once more. Written neatly in faded blue ink were only 3 things. Maple Creek Children's Barn, October 12, 1998. And beneath the date, every child deserves to be remembered. Her fingers tightened around the picture. Something wasn't right. According to the death certificate she'd carried for years, her mother had died in 1988. Yet, this photograph had been taken a full decade later. Either the date was wrong, or everything Alice believed about her mother's death was. She lowered herself onto an old hay bale, trying to steady her breathing. Nothing made sense anymore. For years, she'd accepted that some questions would never have answers. Who had given her mother the necklace? Why had they never spoken about family? Why had her mother always changed the subject whenever Alice asked where she had grown up? Now, for the first time, it felt as though those unanswered questions were all pointing toward the same place. This barn. Alice carefully placed the journal, the letter, the music box, and the photograph back inside her backpack. She wasn't ready to leave them behind. Not anymore. As she reached for the journal again, she noticed something tucked between its final pages. It was a folded piece of paper no larger than a postcard. Across the top was a simple hand-drawn map. Most of the landmarks had faded beyond recognition, but one word remained perfectly clear. Willow Ridge Cemetery. Before Alice could study it further, a loud engine echoed outside. She froze. Moments later, tires crunched across loose gravel. Someone was coming. Alice instinctively closed the compartment beneath the floor, sliding the boards back into place just as footsteps approached the barn. The large wooden door lowly creaked open. An elderly man stepped inside. He appeared to be in his late 70s, maybe older. His denim jacket had faded from years of use, and a weathered canvas hat shaded eyes that had clearly seen more life than they cared to remember. He carried no weapon, only an old walking stick polished smooth by time. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them. Finally, the old man looked around the barn before his eyes settled on Alice. "I figured somebody was in here," he said quietly. The door was open. Alice stood. I'm sorry. I was only trying to stay dry. I'll leave." The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted downward, toward the silver necklace hanging around Alice's neck. The color drained from his face. His grip tightened around the walking stick. For several long seconds, he simply stared, not at Alice, at the necklace. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed. "Where did you get that?" Alice instinctively covered the pendant with her hand. "It belonged to my mother." "What was her name?" The question came too quickly, too urgently. Alice hesitated. "Why?" The old man's expression hardened. "Because I've never seen that necklace on anyone except one person." Alice felt her heartbeat quicken. "My mother's name was Margaret Walker." The old man's eyes closed for a brief moment, almost as though the name carried a weight he hadn't expected to hear again. When he opened them, there was sadness in his face, and fear, real fear. "My name is Benjamin Sullivan," he finally said. "If your mother's name was Margaret, you shouldn't be here." Alice frowned. "What does that mean?" Benjamin looked toward the wooden floor, toward the very place where Alice had discovered the hidden compartment. His eyes lingered there for only a second before returning to her. "You need to leave this barn. Today." Alice crossed her arms. "I found something under the floor." Benjamin's expression changed instantly. "What did you find?" "A journal. A music box. A photograph." The old man's breathing became noticeably slower. "And a letter." Alice watched every movement on his face. He wasn't surprised those things existed. He was surprised someone else had found them. "You've already read the letter," Benjamin said quietly. It wasn't a question. Alice nodded. "Then you know what it says. Please don't let our names disappear." Benjamin looked away. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, he whispered almost to himself, "I was afraid this day would come." Alice stepped closer. "Who wrote it?" Benjamin didn't answer. "Who are the children in the photograph?" Still nothing. "My mother's in that picture." "I know." The words landed like thunder. Alice stared at him. "You knew my mother." Benjamin let out a slow breath. "I knew a young woman who looked exactly like the one in that photograph. She came here many years ago. She helped children nobody else wanted." Alice felt tears forming in her eyes. "Then why did she never tell me?" Benjamin's shoulders sank. "Because sometimes the kindest people carry the heaviest secrets." Alice took another step forward. "My mother died before I was 7. Benjamin remained silent, then explained the date on the photograph. The old man looked at the faded picture in her hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Some dates lie, but not all lies are written with bad intentions." Alice searched his face, hoping for a real answer. Instead, Benjamin slowly turned toward the barn door. "The past has stayed buried here for a long time. If you keep digging, you'll wake people who never wanted these stories told." He started walking away. Alice called after him. "Wait." Benjamin stopped but didn't turn around. Without looking back, he said one final sentence. "If you value the memory of your mother, Be very careful who learns you found that necklace." Then he disappeared into the gray morning. Alice stood alone in the silent barn, the photograph trembling in her hands. The questions had only multiplied. Benjamin Sullivan clearly knew far more than he was willing to admit. He recognized the necklace instantly. He knew her mother's name before Alice had explained anything. He knew exactly what had been hidden beneath the floor. And somehow, he seemed less afraid of the past itself than of someone else discovering that Alice had uncovered it. For the first time, Alice realized she wasn't the only person searching for answers. Someone else had been protecting this secret for decades. And someone else might be trying just as hard to make sure it stayed buried forever. Benjamin Sullivan's warning echoed in Alice's mind long after his truck disappeared down the narrow country road. If you value the memory of your mother, be very careful who learns you found that necklace. Those words weren't spoken like a threat. They sounded like the plea of a man who had spent decades carrying something too heavy to put down. Alice remained standing in the doorway of the barn, staring across the empty fields. Part of her wanted to leave. She had already found more than she'd ever expected. She had no money, no home, and no reason to involve herself in a mystery that clearly frightened an old man who seemed to know far more than he admitted. But another part of her, the little girl who had spent years wondering why her mother had never spoken about her past, couldn't walk away. Not now. She returned to the hidden compartment and carefully opened the leather journal. The first few pages were damaged by moisture, making many of the words impossible to read. Whoever had written it hadn't intended to tell a dramatic story. The entries were simple, almost ordinary. 3 new children arrived today. Emma finally smiled for the first time. The little boy with the broken arm slept through the night. Well, we found enough blankets before the snow came. There were no last names, no explanations, only quiet records of children who had once existed. As Alice continued reading, she began noticing a pattern. Each child had a small symbol drawn beside his or her name. Some had stars, some had circles. A few had tiny flowers, the same 6-petal flower that hung from Alice's necklace. She frowned. The flower didn't appear beside every child, only a handful. Why? She carefully turned another page. Halfway down, one sentence caught her attention. Margaret insisted every child carrying the flower should remain together. Alice froze. Margaret. Her mother's name. She read the sentence again. There was no last name, but it couldn't be another coincidence. Her mother hadn't simply visited this barn. She had worked here. She had known these children. She had been important enough for someone to write about her. Alice's heart pounded. For the first time in her life, she wasn't reading about her mother through hospital records or government paperwork. She was reading about the woman herself. Kind, patient, protective, alive. A tear slipped down her cheek before she realized she was crying. She gently brushed it away. "If you were here," she whispered. "What were you trying so hard to protect?" Just then, another folded page slipped from the journal and drifted onto the floor. It wasn't part of the diary. It looked newer. On one side was a short list of names. Most had been crossed out. Only 3 remained. The final name was underlined twice. Benjamin Sullivan. Alice stared at it. Benjamin wasn't simply an old man who happened to know about the barn. His name had been preserved with the others, which meant he hadn't just witnessed this place, he had belonged to it. By late afternoon, hunger forced Alice back into town. She spent the last few dollars she had on coffee and a bowl of soup at a small diner just off the highway. The waitress smiled kindly but didn't ask questions. Perhaps she'd seen too many travelers passing through over the years. As Alice quietly ate, two older men sitting in a nearby booth began talking. The old Harper place finally sold. About time. They're tearing everything down next month. Alice looked up. The old barn, too. One man nodded. Whole property's going. Some company from Louisville bought the land. They're building vacation cabins. The demolition crew starts in less than 3 weeks. Alice felt her stomach tighten. 3 weeks. If the barn disappeared, everything hidden beneath it would disappear too. She finished her meal quickly and walked to the town library. It was small, quiet, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else's name. An elderly librarian greeted her with a warm smile. "Can I help you find something?" Alice hesitated. "I'm looking for information about an old property, the Harper farm." The librarian's smile faded slightly. "I haven't heard that name in years." She led Alice toward a cabinet filled with local newspaper archives. "You won't find much. Most of the records were lost after the courthouse fire. But there are still a few old newspapers." For nearly 2 hours, Alice searched article after article. Farm auctions, county fairs, church picnics, nothing. Then, buried inside a newspaper from decades earlier, she found a tiny article no larger than a postcard. Its headline read, "Local volunteer honored for service to orphaned children." The accompanying photograph had faded badly. The faces were almost impossible to distinguish. But one elderly man standing near the back looked strangely familiar. Benjamin, only much younger. The article mentioned that volunteers had operated a temporary shelter for abandoned children on farmland outside town. No address, no details. Just one sentence near the bottom. The shelter closed following an unexplained fire. Fire. Alice had never heard Benjamin mention a fire. She quickly copied the article onto a notepad before returning the newspaper. As she walked toward the library exit, the librarian quietly called after her. "You knew those people." Alice turned. "No. I'm just trying to understand what happened." The older woman looked thoughtful. "I was only a little girl, but I remember my father saying something strange." "What did he say?" She lowered her voice. "He always believed the fire wasn't an accident." Alice felt the room grow very still. "What do you mean?" The librarian shook her head. "Nobody ever proved anything. People simply stopped talking about it. They acted as though the place had never existed." Outside, evening shadows stretched across the quiet streets. Alice stood alone beneath the courthouse clock, clutching her notebook. The story was changing. She had come searching for answers about her mother. Instead, she had uncovered the outline of something much larger. A forgotten shelter, a suspicious fire, missing records, Benjamin Sullivan, and a barn scheduled to disappear forever in less than 3 weeks. For the first time since opening the hidden compartment, Alice understood what frightened Benjamin so deeply. It wasn't the past. The past had already happened. It was the possibility that someone, somewhere, still had a reason to keep that past buried. Alice barely slept that night. She had returned to the barn just before sunset, carrying nothing more than a flashlight, the copied newspaper article, and a growing sense that time was slipping through her fingers. 3 weeks? That was all the old barn had left before bulldozers would erase every trace of it. If the truth was hidden here, it wouldn't stay hidden much longer. The journal lay open beside her as she read each page again, this time paying less attention to the children's names and more to the details surrounding them. Most entries described ordinary moments, birthday cakes baked from whatever ingredients could be found, scraped knees, bedtime stories, winter storms. But toward the end of the journal, the tone changed. The handwriting became hurried. Sentences grew shorter. Several pages had been torn out completely. Then one unfinished entry stopped her cold. They're asking questions now. Someone has been watching the road. Margaret says we must move the sentence ended abruptly. The rest of the page had been ripped away. Move what? The children. The records. Something else. Alice gently closed the journal. Whoever had removed those pages hadn't wanted anyone to know how the story ended. Just then, headlights swept across the front of the barn. She quickly switched off her flashlight. Another truck. For a split second, she feared someone had come to force her out. Instead, Benjamin Sullivan slowly climbed out of the driver's seat. He looked even more exhausted than before. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of decades. Without speaking, he handed Alice a brown paper bag. I figured you hadn't eaten. Inside was a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. Alice looked up. You didn't have to do this. Benjamin gave a faint smile. Someone once taught me that hungry people can't solve difficult problems. Alice couldn't help smiling back. My mother used to say something similar. Benjamin's smile faded almost immediately. I know. Silence settled between them. Finally, Alice asked the question she'd been carrying all day. Were you one of the people who ran this place? Benjamin looked around the empty barn before answering. We never called it a shelter. What did you call it? A home? He spoke the word so quietly it was almost carried away by the wind. For children who had nowhere else to go. Alice glanced toward the journal. How many? Benjamin stared into the darkness. I stopped counting after 50. Alice's heart sank. 50 children. Over many years. Some stayed a week. Some stayed until they were old enough to leave. And some... His voice broke. I never found another family. Alice understood now why the journal recorded birthdays instead of paperwork. Whoever had cared for these children wasn't interested in documents. They wanted the children to feel remembered. Benjamin walked slowly toward one of the support beams, resting his hand against the weathered wood. I helped repair this barn when I was 19. I thought it'd last forever. It almost did. Alice stepped closer. Then tell me about Margaret. Benjamin closed his eyes. For a long moment, he didn't answer. When I first met your mother, he finally said, she was younger than you are now. She believed every child deserved one person who would never give up on them. Even when the world already had. Alice felt tears filling her eyes again. She really worked here. Benjamin nodded. Every weekend. Every holiday. If a child was frightened, Margaret stayed beside them. If someone had nightmares, she stayed awake. If someone cried, she listened. Benjamin smiled sadly. She had a way of making forgotten children believe they still mattered. Alice lowered her head. Then why did she never tell me? Benjamin looked away. Because she promised. Promised who? I can't answer that. Not yet. Alice's frustration finally spilled over. Everyone keeps telling me to wait. My whole life I've been waiting. For answers. For family. For someone to tell me who I really am. Benjamin's expression softened. I know. No, you don't. I do. The old man reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed an old black and white photograph. He handed it to Alice. It showed a much younger Benjamin standing beside several volunteers outside the barn. Near the center stood Margaret. She was smiling, resting one hand on Benjamin's shoulder. On the back was a handwritten sentence. Family isn't always the people who raise you. Sometimes it's the people who refuse to abandon you. Alice traced her mother's handwriting with trembling fingers. I've never seen this before. There are many things you haven't seen. Benjamin took a slow breath. And that's exactly why they're tearing this place down. Alice looked up sharply. What do you mean? This land wasn't bought because someone wanted vacation cabins. They're only an excuse? Alice stared at him. You think someone wants the barn destroyed? I know they do. Who? Benjamin shook his head. I don't have proof, but some people have spent decades pretending this place never existed. They won't be happy if what's buried here reaches the newspapers. Alice suddenly remembered the missing diary pages, the courthouse fire, the destroyed records, the unexplained silence surrounding the shelter. None of it felt accidental anymore. What are they hiding? She asked. Benjamin answered with a question of his own. Have you ever wondered why no official records mention the children who lived here? Alice had, more than once. Benjamin continued. Children disappear much more easily on paper than they do in real life. The words sent a chill through Alice. You think records were erased? I think someone wanted history rewritten. The barn fell silent once more. Outside, the wind rustled through the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Benjamin slowly reached into another pocket and removed a small brass key. It was old, scratched, and worn smooth from years of use. He placed it in Alice's hand. I've carried this for 42 years. What does it open? I was hoping I'd never have to find out. Alice looked at the tiny number engraved on the key. 17. Benjamin nodded toward the folded map she had found inside the journal. There's one place on that map we never searched. Willow Ridge Cemetery. Alice remembered the name immediately. The map. It wasn't leading you to a grave, Benjamin said quietly. It was leading you beneath one. Alice looked at him in disbelief. What could possibly be hidden in a cemetery? Benjamin's face turned pale. The one thing everyone thought had been destroyed in the fire. He paused, then spoke the words that changed everything. The original records, if they still exist, they can prove every child who ever lived here. Alice tightened her grip around the brass key. For the first time, the mystery wasn't just about her mother anymore. It was about dozens of forgotten children whose names had nearly vanished forever. And if someone truly intended to erase that history, then Alice and Benjamin had only one chance to save it before the barn, and perhaps the truth itself disappeared forever. The following morning arrived, wrapped in a thick blanket of fog. Alice met Benjamin just after sunrise at the entrance to Willow Ridge Cemetery. The place was older than she expected. Weathered headstones leaned at odd angles, their names softened by decades of wind and rain. Massive oak trees stretched their branches overhead, casting long shadows across the quiet rows of graves. Benjamin stood beside his old pickup truck, holding a shovel. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, he looked toward the folded map Alice carried. Show me. Alice unfolded the fragile paper across the hood of the truck. Most of the ink had faded beyond recognition, but one detail now stood out. A tiny hand-drawn cross. Beside it, the number 17. Slowly, Alice reached into her coat pocket and removed the brass key. The same number. 17. Benjamin let out a quiet sigh. I hoped I was wrong. You've been here before, Alice asked. Many times, but never with the courage to finish what we started. Together they walked through the cemetery, counting the rows exactly as the map suggested. 7, 10, 14. Then finally, Row 17. There was no elaborate monument, only a small stone marker almost hidden beneath the tall grass. Unlike the surrounding graves, this one carried no name, only 3 carved words. Never forgotten. Benjamin knelt silently before it. For a long moment, he simply stared. "I helped place this stone," he whispered. Alice looked at him in surprise. "Who's buried here?" Benjamin slowly shook his head. "No one." Alice frowned. "What do you mean?" "It isn't a grave. It never was." He reached beneath the stone and brushed away decades of packed dirt. There. A rusted iron ring emerged from the earth. Alice's pulse quickened. Working together, they pulled upward. Beneath the stone lay a narrow metal hatch. The brass key fit perfectly into the old lock. For a second, neither of them moved. Benjamin looked at Alice. "Once we open this, there won't be any going back." Alice nodded. "I stopped turning back the day I walked into that barn." She turned the key. The lock clicked. With considerable effort, they lifted the heavy hatch. A damp rush of cool air drifted upward. A narrow concrete chamber rested beneath the cemetery. It was barely large enough for 2 people to stand inside. Dust coated every surface. Against one wall sat 3 steel filing cabinets, a wooden trunk, several sealed storage boxes, and dozens of carefully labeled binders. Benjamin removed his hat. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. They survived. Alice stepped forward carefully. Every cabinet carried handwritten labels, medical records, birth certificates, volunteer files, placement records. She stared in disbelief. "This is everything." Benjamin nodded slowly. "We thought it had all burned." Alice opened the nearest drawer. Inside were hundreds of neatly organized folders. Every child, every volunteer, every donation, every letter. Someone had preserved the entire history of the shelter. Then she found something that made her stop breathing. One folder, labeled in faded handwriting. "Walker, Alice." Her hands began to shake. Benjamin noticed immediately. "What is it?" Alice couldn't answer. She simply held up the folder. Benjamin's face turned white. "No." He whispered, "No." With trembling fingers, Alice opened it. Inside wasn't a government adoption file. It was much more personal. A tiny hospital bracelet, a lock of infant hair sealed inside clear paper, a faded footprint card, and a handwritten note folded neatly on top. The handwriting looked painfully familiar. Her mother's. Alice unfolded the letter. "If you're reading this, then somehow you've found your way home." Tears instantly filled her eyes. She continued reading. "I wanted to tell you the truth myself, more than anything. But there were people who promised they would destroy this place and everyone connected to it if the truth ever became public." Alice looked up. Benjamin had gone completely still. "You knew." He slowly lowered his eyes. "I suspected." "You suspected what?" "That you weren't just visiting this story. You were born inside it." Alice looked back at the letter. "You weren't abandoned. You weren't forgotten. You were loved every single day of your life. The hardest decision I ever made was sending you away." Alice felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Everything she had believed about herself, every lonely birthday, every unanswered question, every night wondering why no one had come back for her, suddenly felt different. Her mother hadn't walked away. She had sacrificed everything. Benjamin quietly sat on an old wooden crate. There were powerful people involved. What people? They operated children's institutions across several counties. As some children disappeared. Some records disappeared with them. When Margaret discovered what was happening, he paused. She refused to stay silent. Alice stared at him. So they threatened her. Benjamin nodded. They couldn't risk the shelter exposing what they'd done. So we moved the records. The children who could leave, left, and those who couldn't. His voice cracked. We prayed someone would protect them. Alice turned another page inside her file. There was one final document. A birth certificate. Except it wasn't the one she'd carried all her life. This one listed a different birthplace. The old barn. She looked at Benjamin in complete disbelief. I was born here. He slowly nodded. You came into this world upstairs. The storm that night was so fierce the roads flooded. No doctor could reach us. Alice covered her mouth. My mother. She never left your side. Benjamin smiled through tears. She said you arrived fighting, like you already knew life wouldn't be easy. Alice laughed softly through her tears. For the first time in years. She wasn't crying because she felt alone. She was crying because somehow she never had been. Then Benjamin's smile disappeared. He looked toward the open hatch. Someone's here. Alice listened. At first she heard nothing. Then, footsteps. More than one pair, crunching slowly across the gravel above them. Voices. Male. Getting closer. Benjamin's expression hardened. They found us. Alice's heartbeat raced. Who? Benjamin quietly closed the folder and placed it back into her hands. The people who've spent 40 years making sure these records were never found. The footsteps stopped directly above the hidden chamber. Then a shadow crossed the opening. Someone was looking down. For one long, terrifying moment. No one moved. Alice clutched the folder bearing her name against her chest, while Benjamin quietly closed the drawer containing the remaining records. The shadow above the hidden chamber shifted. Then a man's voice echoed downward. I thought I'd find someone here. Benjamin's face tightened. He knew that voice. Slow, deliberate footsteps circled the opening before another elderly man appeared above them. He was neatly dressed in an expensive overcoat, far too elegant for a country cemetery. Two younger men stood several feet behind him. Neither spoke. They simply watched. The older man smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind worn by someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Benjamin, he said calmly, I was hoping you had finally learned to leave the past alone. Benjamin slowly climbed the ladder, placing himself between Alice and the opening. The past isn't yours to bury anymore. The man sighed. It never had to become complicated. You could have let this place disappear with dignity. Benjamin shook his head. Dignity. You erased children? You erased families. You erased lives. The man's smile faded. We protected the reputation of this community. Benjamin laughed bitterly. No. You protected yourselves. Alice listened in stunned silence. She still didn't know the man's name, but one thing was obvious. Benjamin had been afraid of him for decades. The stranger's eyes drifted toward Alice. So, you're Margaret's daughter. Alice instinctively stepped backward. You knew my mother. I knew of her. She was a remarkably stubborn woman. Benjamin's voice rose sharply. Don't you dare speak about her. The man ignored him. She believed the truth would save everyone. He paused before adding quietly, She was wrong. Alice's hands tightened around the folder. My mother tried to protect those children. The man nodded without emotion. Yes, and in doing so, she nearly destroyed dozens of respectable careers. Alice felt anger replacing fear. Respectable. Children disappeared. Records vanished. You call that respectable? The man stared at her for several seconds. Then, almost sadly, he said, "History is rarely as simple as heroes and villains." Benjamin stepped forward. "No, but this story is—" Silence settled over the cemetery. Finally, the older man looked toward the filing cabinets below. "What do you want, Benjamin?" "The truth." And then Benjamin glanced back at Alice. So she never spends another day believing she was abandoned. The stranger looked at Alice again. For the first time, something almost resembling regret crossed his face. "You've already found your answers. Take them. Walk away. Leave the rest buried." Alice slowly shook her head. "What about the other children?" No one answered. "What about their families? What about the people who spent their entire lives believing no one cared whether they existed?" The man's silence became his answer. Benjamin smiled proudly. "She sounds exactly like Margaret." The stranger's expression hardened once again. "You don't understand what releasing those files will do. It will destroy families." Benjamin answered quietly. "No. It will destroy lies." One of the younger men stepped forward. "Sir, we're wasting time." The older man nodded. Then he surprised everyone. He stepped aside. "I'm too old to fight this anymore." He looked directly at Benjamin. "Perhaps we all are." Without another word, he turned and walked away. The two younger men hesitated before following him. Within moments, the cemetery was silent once again. Alice looked at Benjamin in disbelief. "That's it. They're just leaving." Benjamin watched the three figures disappear beyond the trees. They've spent 40 years protecting a secret. They know they can't stop the truth forever. The following days passed in a blur. Benjamin contacted an attorney he had trusted for years. Alice reached out to a historical preservation organization. Every document hidden beneath the cemetery was photographed, cataloged, and placed into secure storage before the demolition crews could reach the old barn. News spread quickly. Local newspapers published the story first, then regional television stations. Soon, historians, former foster children, and families from across the state began contacting the Preservation Committee. Some recognized names from the records. Others recognized photographs. For dozens of people, the files answered questions that had remained unanswered for half a century. One afternoon, an elderly woman arrived carrying a faded black and white photograph. She stared at the restored records for several minutes before quietly beginning to cry. "I've spent 62 years looking for my little brother." Benjamin gently opened one of the binders. There he was. His name. His birthday. The family that eventually adopted him. The woman covered her mouth as tears rolled down her face. "I thought he was gone forever." Benjamin simply reached over and held her hand. Alice watched people reunite with pieces of their own lives, one after another. Every folder told a story. Every photograph returned someone's name. Every page restored a memory that had nearly been erased forever. Only then did Alice truly understand why her mother had risked everything. She hadn't been protecting paper. She had been protecting people. Several weeks later, demolition crews finally arrived at the old farm. Alice and Benjamin stood together across the road as heavy machinery rolled toward the weathered barn. Neither of them spoke. The first wall collapsed with a deep groan that echoed across the fields. Dust filled the morning air. Within minutes, the place that had sheltered frightened children for decades was reduced to broken timber. Alice wiped away a tear. "I thought this would feel like losing it all over again." Benjamin smiled gently. "It isn't gone." He placed one hand over his heart. "A home doesn't disappear when the building falls. It survives in the people who remember it." Alice looked across the empty field one final time. The barn was gone. But for the first time in 50 years, its story was finally alive, and so was her mother's. A year passed. The headlines faded. Television cameras left. The reporters moved on to newer stories. But for Alice Walker, the story had never really been about an abandoned barn. It had always been about one simple question she had carried since childhood. Did anyone ever truly want me? Now, she finally knew the answer. Every page her mother had left behind answered that question more clearly than words ever could. She had been loved. She had been protected. And every difficult choice her mother made had been driven by that love. The truth hadn't erased Alice's painful childhood. It hadn't given back the birthdays she spent alone, or the years she wondered why no one came for her. But it changed how she remembered them. She was no longer the little girl who believed she had been forgotten. She was the daughter of a woman who had sacrificed everything so that others might have a chance to live. Benjamin Sullivan lived just long enough to see the restoration project completed. The old records were safely preserved inside the county historical archives, where every child who had once passed through the shelter now had a name, a story, and a place in history. On a warm spring afternoon, Benjamin asked Alice to meet him beneath the large oak tree overlooking the empty field where the barn had once stood. Nothing remained except wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. Benjamin smiled as he looked across the land. "You know, I used to think we failed." Alice looked at him. "Failed? We couldn't save the barn. We couldn't save every child. We couldn't stop people from lying." He paused before continuing. "But I finally realized something." Alice waited quietly. "A place isn't remembered because its walls survive. It's remembered because love leaves footprints that time can't erase." For a long while, neither of them spoke. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass across the open field. Birds sang from the nearby trees. It was peaceful. Exactly the kind of peace Benjamin had spent a lifetime searching for. A few weeks later, Alice received a phone call. Benjamin had passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 81 years old. Among his belongings was a small envelope addressed to her. Inside, she found a handwritten letter. "Dear Alice, if you're reading this, then I've finally gone where old caretakers belong. Don't waste your life protecting buildings. Protect people. The barn was never the miracle. The people inside it were. Now it's your turn." Alice read the letter several times before folding it carefully and placing it beside her mother's necklace. It became the second promise she carried close to her heart. Months later, with help from donations inspired by the story, Alice opened a small community home for young adults leaving foster care. It wasn't large. It wasn't fancy. But no one who walked through its doors ever heard the words, "You're on your own." Every bedroom contained a handmade quilt. Every birthday was celebrated. Every new resident received something simple before unpacking. A warm meal, a key, and a handwritten note. "You matter." Alice never told them they owed her anything. Because once, long ago, someone had done exactly the same for children who had nowhere else to go. One afternoon, a frightened 18-year-old girl arrived carrying everything she owned inside a worn backpack. She stood nervously at the doorway, unsure whether she belonged. Alice smiled and welcomed her inside. Before closing the door, she gently placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "I don't know everything you've been through," she said softly, "but I do know one thing. You'll never have to face tomorrow alone again." The young woman burst into tears. So did Alice, because she suddenly understood something her mother had known all along. Sometimes healing doesn't begin when we find the answers. Sometimes it begins the moment we become the answer someone else has been praying for. Life has a way of convincing us that our past defines our future. If we grow up feeling abandoned, we often believe we will always be alone. If we experience loss, we may begin to think love never lasts. But the truth is often much more complicated and much more hopeful. The people who love us don't always get to stay beside us. Sometimes circumstances separate families. Sometimes fear, sacrifice, or impossible choices hide the truth for years. That doesn't mean the love was never real. Alice spent most of her life believing she had been forgotten. In reality, she had been loved more deeply than she ever imagined. The evidence wasn't found in wealth or inheritance. It was found in sacrifice, in promises, in people who quietly chose compassion when no one was watching. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all. Family is not built only by blood. It is built by those who refuse to let another human being face life alone. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need a little hope today. And tell us in the comments, have you ever met someone whose kindness changed the course of your life forever? We'd love to read your story.